Hey guys, good to see you again in a manner of speaking. It's a new year and we are returning to posting weekly videos. The intent of these videos is to help us prepare our hearts and to think deeply, a little more deeply about the passage that we'll be teaching to our kids this coming Sunday. So, we are picking up in this new year by chatting for a moment about story 14 in the Biggest Story Bible Storybook. This lesson is entitled Free at Last. It is taken from Exodus 4 through 15, and the focus passage that the curriculum encourages us to read before we teach this on Sunday is Exodus 12:21 through 14:31. In each of the lessons, there is this section that is meant for our teachers. It says before the lesson, and it encourages you to read this passage that's identified here, pray for God's help, ask for the Spirit's help in understanding, and pray for your students as well, and then take a little bit of time to study, to read through the lesson, to read through the passage, and think about how you're going to teach it. So hopefully this little exercise that I do is just an encouragement to think about how you're going to teach this passage of Scripture to your students this coming Sunday. This coming Sunday is the second Sunday in January, so we are prepping for January 12th. And I want to mention a few things. I have been dwelling on this passage and this lesson. And in general, I think our curriculum, the Biggest Story curriculum, does a great job connecting what we're talking about this week to what came before it, and then encouraging us to look ahead to see how this story, this part of the big story, points us towards Jesus, or how what we're talking about in this story is fulfilled in Jesus. So you can rely on the curriculum. It will give you so many good tools and good ideas. But one of the encouragements in the curriculum that I want to reiterate here is to think about how to teach this in your voice and to your students. So I'm really grateful we have a good curriculum. This exercise is still so helpful as you prepare to teach. One thing that the Biggest Story does is it takes these large swaths of scripture. So, for instance, here, Exodus 4 through 15, and teaches them in story format. So often, what we see in our current curriculum in these lessons is that stories that would be taught in other curricula from a bit different approach would be segmented more. So, for instance, our story just preceding this was about Moses. We learned that Moses, what the situation was in Egypt, that Moses' people were slaves, about the edict that was given by Pharaoh. Moses' mother placed him in a basket, his sister watched over him, and then we learned that Moses grew up, left Egypt, was gone for 40 years, had an encounter with a burning bush. It's a lot. It's a lot of Moses' life to cover all at once. And similarly, this story covers a large chunk of the story of Exodus. But the approach in this curriculum is a bit different. However, I want us to think together this week about a few things. So, the Bible as a whole is a collection of books that are written in different literary styles like narrative, poetry, and prose. And the Bible is literature from a specific people group in a specific part of the world in a specific time. So every time we read, especially one of these portions of Old Testament scripture like what we're encountering this week in Exodus, we need to bear all of that in mind. The Bible is a specific type of literature. It's ancient Jewish wisdom literature, which means that it has certain features. For instance, it includes certain details that modern readers might find superfluous. So think about all the genealogies, some of the things that are mentioned that we don't tend to hang on to as modern Western readers when we read through the text. At the same time, this type of literature lacks other details that we would expect. And that's not because the writers forgot things or were ignorant. Every detail that is given matters, and often details that don't support the main point the author is making aren't included, even though we might wonder about them. Another feature of this type of literature is the use of symbol. So many patterns or symbols appear throughout Scripture. And the intent is that we make sense of these, that we note them and make sense of them in light of the other places in Scripture where they reappear. In other words, we must read the story as a whole. And when we do, and when we trace these rich literary symbols throughout, we get a better understanding of God, how he has revealed himself, how the covenants throughout Scripture unfold into each other, what the movement of Scripture reveals to us, and we get a better sense of this big story and of ourselves in relationship to that story, where we fit, how we're related to God and to each other and to his world. Our curriculum attempts to do this, and it does so quite well, but it's also attempting to do it for a specific audience, for children. And so as we're teaching, we need to pay attention to these patterns that pop up in our stories that are not necessarily the focal point of the stories, and yet we want our kids to notice them too, so that as they read Scripture and as we together track through the curriculum this year, we can start to identify, to draw our attention and their attention to these important patterns and emphasize them, so that we provide our students a point of reference, something to hang on to. So as we continue to move through the biggest story and trace the movement of Scripture, that we can refer back to these patterns and symbols and ideas that were introduced to us in the stories we're reading now, that will come up again and again as we move through Scripture over the next couple of years. The Exodus narrative that we're looking at today is full of these kinds of references. For instance, in this week's story, we're going to cover the plagues, the death of the firstborn, the Passover lamb, and the crossing of the Red Sea. And I didn't even mention all of them. Each of those that I just mentioned reappears in scriptural narrative many times and finds its conclusion in Jesus and is mentioned in the New Testament. So let's talk for a moment about one of these symbols so I can demonstrate what I'm referencing here. Let's talk for a moment about the Passover lamb. So God, via Moses, told the Israelites to prepare for the last plague. God was going to send the angel of the Lord to pass over the homes of the Israelites and the Egyptians, and to distinguish between the two, and to see who had listened. It was also a sort of a test. To distinguish between them, God instructed the Israelites to select a lamb without blemish. So there were certain parameters about what sort of lamb they were to select. Kill it, and then apply its blood to the doorposts. Now, there's much more to that story, but the point is this symbol, the Passover lamb, reappears over and over, and then notably in Luke 22 and Matthew 26, Jesus identifies himself as the Passover lamb. He explains that he is the final Passover lamb. And then Paul again picks this up in 1 Corinthians 5, for instance, by referring to Christ as our Passover lamb. So we're introducing this symbol this week that is important for the rest of the biblical narrative. Or let's talk for a moment about the crossing of the Red Sea. So in 1 Corinthians 10:2, Paul compares baptism to the Israelites' crossing of the Red Sea. Now, when we keep that in mind as we're studying for the story this week, it enriches our understanding of the significance of the crossing of the Red Sea, even if the Israelites couldn't see all of that at the moment that God provided dry land for them to cross over. Now, my point is not that you should teach all of these symbols and talk about all of these things to your children. My point is that you should bear them in mind as you study, and then look at what our big truth is this week, that God saves his people from the Egyptians. So this is the main point that our curriculum writer wants us to focus on, and I agree. That is the main point. That's what we want to stick in our kids' minds. But what enriches the story of Scripture for you? As you think about these symbols that appear in our story this week that are significant to our understanding of our own redemption and how God frees us, what he accomplished for us through Jesus. Think about that, and then think about what you want to emphasize. So I'm going to leave you with this question as far as how you're going to teach in your own voice this week for your particular students, who are various ages. God saves his people from the Egyptians. How? How did he do that? And our story talks about how. Figure out what you want your students to walk away with this week.